Last night's one and only vice presidential debate turned out to be a much more rewarding viewer experience than the first presidential debate. Lively, informative, with a moderator to match, and this seemed to live up to what voters both wanted and needed. Here to recap, Democratic analyst Michael Murphy and Republican analyst Bill Spadea. Gentlemen, I'd say start your engines, but the two gentlemen last night did that for us. Let me get your initial thoughts following the debate.
Well, the question everybody asked, who won? I would say Martha Raddatz.
Certainly.
over Jim Lair. She was, I think she took control of the debate, might be too strong a word, the lively discussion between two people who I think kind of like each other, but it didn't come clear last night. But I think Martha Raddatz did a great job. And debates are really about theater. And it was a great theatrical performance. Joe Biden was like George C. Scott in Death of a Salesman. He played his role. He played his role out to the max. I think Paul Ryan, and frankly, there's an age difference, at least a generation. Paul Ryan looked a little bit like the frat boy who crammed for his final exam. He looked a little nervous, and the juxtaposition was interesting. But I think it was a lively debate, good for the president because it really teed it up and it repainted the canvas for next Tuesday, which was going to be a very important debate.
Bill?
You might be surprised to disagree with a couple points you made. I'll tell you.
Indeed.
First of all, I actually thought Jim Lair did a better job hosting the presidential debate than Raddatz did last night for this reason. It was almost like you had a third debating partner in the conversation. She would team up with one and then team up with the other. And I think a debate is less about theater and more about the independent voters out there that are still undecided saying, what do these guys stand for? Have they really articulated their different positions? And I'll tell you, from a Democratic perspective, Joe Biden did his job. He came out where the president was lacking and very flat. Joe Biden was feisty and fiery and came out. But where the Republicans are concerned, Paul Ryan also did his job, showed himself to be measured and controlled. And, he was not only in control of himself, but I think he really showed that he's got what it takes to be the president should that need arise. But really, when it all boils down, where did the independents and the undecideds fall? And I think Joe Biden did himself a real disservice with the snarky laughter and the interrupting. I mean, honestly, it was uncalled for. It was unprofessional. I think that Paul Ryan came out ahead because he kept himself under control.
The one thing that I was advised years ago, and I did some debates when I ran for governor of New Jersey about almost 15 years ago, is be yourself. And nobody will accuse Joe Biden of not being himself. Maybe channeling his inner Mean Joe Green, but he made his presence felt.
Well, the pundits joked about that in the days before, that Joe being Joe, as the president had suggested, would open the show up for some very interesting discourse, and it certainly did.
Yeah.
At one point in the debate, where the exchange between the candidates got particularly heated, Paul Ryan actually acknowledged the elephant in the room, and that was a high-stakes debate for the Obama campaign. Let's take a listen.
7.4 million seniors are projected to lose the current Medicare Advantage coverage they have. That's a $3,200 benefit cut.
That didn't
what we're
happen.
saying,
more people signed
these are
up.
from your own actuaries.
More people signed up for Medicare Advantage after the change.
What they're saying,
nobody is
Mr. Vice President,
down.
I know,
Mr. Vice President,
I know you're under a lot of duress to make up for lost ground, but I think people would be better served if we don't keep interrupting each other.
Gentlemen, let me get your reaction. I was expecting a Ronald Reagan moment from Biden, but it didn't happen. But let me get your thoughts, Bill, on that.
Well, Paul Ryan did a very good job of essentially pointing out that, look, you can talk over me, you can interrupt me, you can laugh at me, but it doesn't take away from the central message that it's the Democrats that are raiding Medicaid or Medicare to pay for Obamacare. I think that was a key point. I also think that a lot of the vice president's factual points, we're going to put some of them in quotes, didn't hold up when he attacked them for the $5 trillion. And, Democrats love to attack Republicans on tax cuts because they view it in this very static world that if you cut taxes by a certain percentage, you're going to then lose revenue. And what I think Paul Ryan did a great job of talking about was, look, taxes went down with Bill Clinton, taxes went down with Jack Kennedy, taxes went down with Ronald Reagan, and in all three cases it stimulated economic growth. And look, the people are not stupid. They realize that there's a lot of talking points back and forth, but the bottom line is that just like in the first presidential debate, the question can be asked and answered, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And for most Americans, that answer is no. It's time for a change.
And that question was never raised last night. And as Bill points out, the tax stimulus policy is good. The difference between Democrats and Republicans is the Republicans want to give an enormous tax stimulus to the 1%. Joe Biden says no for middle-class people. I think the takeaway last night, though, was Joe Biden looking directly into the camera and saying, these guys were never really big on Medicare. And people remember that Republicans, to a man, or well, some women, but in 1964, when Medicare was passed by Lyndon Johnson, it wasn't a Republican program, and they've been trying to pick it apart since then. That's a critical group, and I think when Joe Biden looked directly into the camera, he connected. One candidate, Paul Ryan, talked about actuaries and crunch numbers. Joe Biden spoke directly to the people with passion, and I think that's what really wins debates.
Let me ask you one thought here. There was a point where Biden exposed Ryan when they were talking about the stimulus, and he said, well, look, you wrote 2 letters asking me for some of that stimulus money. I thought that from a voter perspective, that really was very revealing.
It was a gotcha moment.
I don't know. I don't know if it was so much of a gotcha moment as it was just defining what a congressman does. If you've got federal money that's going to be spent in a certain state, it's up to the member of Congress who was elected by those constituents to say, look, if this money is coming here, here's the right place to put it. So to me, that was just defining his job.
This whole they've lambasted the stimulus from day one.
Of course they have.
It wasn't Paul Ryan's best moment.
No, it wasn't. But look, it was not worse than when the vice president was completely disingenuous. And maybe I could almost go so far to say as he made up his own facts when they called him out on the Benghazi embassy security, when he said, well, nobody asked us to increase security. So, if you really boil it down, the most of this debate last night was about foreign policy, which was a little surprising, I think, to some, but they kept talking about it. The vice president got called out on the lack of security.
Very first question, you're absolutely right. The very first question she asked him was a security failure.
And Martha Raddatz's background is in international affairs and foreign relations. But I think one of the domestic issues that the Republicans have been pointing out throughout this campaign is that in this economy we need a businessman to lead the country. And I think that Democrats should point out that maybe that's true, and maybe the model is Governor Romney. But Governor George Romney, who headed AMC, would never have said bankrupt Detroit the way his son Mitt Romney did say. When they did long-range planning in Detroit back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they didn't just think about next year's gremlins. They thought about 5 and 10 years and generations ahead, not like Bain Capital, which thinks about how much money to make tomorrow.
Like, all due respect, the point came up, and I think it was not only was it not a gotcha moment, but let's put in perspective why the Republicans opposed the stimulus, why the Republicans opposed the policies of this administration. Unemployment is still at or near 8%. You can talk about the drop to 7.8. Certainly there are a lot of CEOs out there disputing that number, number one. Number two, the national deficit has doubled. Gas prices have doubled. Your long-term unemployed are still 41% of the unemployed. That's 27 weeks or more. So you've got serious, serious problems in our economy. This is an overall issue. It's not about 2 letters that one congressman wrote to the vice president about where to put some money. Not about that.
I want to get back to some of the arguments over the foreign policy. Stark choices before voters in November became very clear when Vice President Biden and Paul Ryan laid out their positions on foreign policy issues, in particular in Syria. Here's a clip from that exchange.
And all this loose talk of my friend Governor Romney and the congressman about how we could do so much more in there. What more would they do other than put American boots in the ground? The last thing America needs is to get in another ground war in the Middle East.
Congressman Ryan.
Nobody is proposing to send troops to Syria, American troops.
What would my friend do differently? If you notice, he never answers the question.
No, we would not be going through the UN on all of these things.
You don't go through the UN.
Gentlemen, your thoughts on that?
The interesting point there was, number one, this administration did go through the UN, and as Congressman Ryan pointed out, it effectively gave Vladimir Putin a veto power over our foreign policy decisions, number one. Number two, the question was asked about a nuclear Iran, before they started talking about Syria, and the question was asked and answered, and one of the things Paul Ryan said was, look, better to commit troops and risk a conflict than to destabilize the region by having Iran with nuclear weapons. And this argument that the vice president made about weapons delivery, I think is completely ludicrous when you think about the potential of a dirty bomb, the potential of something in a container on a freight ship. I mean, this is a very unstable region, and I think Congressman Ryan made a very clear point that leadership is what's needed, good decision making, not apologies, and certainly not waiting 2 weeks after the fact when your intelligence gathering told you it was a terrorist attack, blaming it on a YouTube video talking about Benghazi.
I'll give you the last word on that.
Though we're talking about Syria, I think Joe Biden very simply and somewhat elegantly, to borrow a term from Mitt Romney, made his point when he said, Mr. Ryan, do you want to start another war? Do you want another war? He said several times, are you talking about another war in the Middle East? When the Republicans in the Bush administration arguing that WMDs existed in Iraq, we had a war there, we're engaged in Afghanistan. We're not a warlike nation. We have 49 allies behind us, and the economy in Syria is plummeting. They devalued their currency by 40%. It's working. So I think there's
Paul
not.
Ryan said he didn't want another war. He did say we're not going to commit American troops unless American strategic interests are involved. So again, I think it was asked and answered on Syria.
Well, I think the Republicans have a credibility gap when it comes to starting wars in the Middle East.
Well, we're going to let it go on that note,
Thanks.
but thank you both, Mr. Murphy and Mr. Spadea. Always a pleasure to have you
Thanks,
both.
Brian.
And of course, 25 days left. We'll do this again very soon.
Thanks.